History sounds neat only when textbooks lie by omission. In reality, the timeline is a drunk filing cabinet. Mammoths overlap with pyramids, guillotines overlap with Star Wars, and Nintendo is older than things your brain refuses to accept. Here are 32 history facts that sound completely wrong, until you realize the universe has terrible organization skills. 1. Woolly mammoths were still alive while Egyptians were stacking the pyramids. Not in a vague, history is weird way, but directly on the timeline. The Great Pyramid of Giza was finished around 2560 BC, while a small population of mammoths survived on Wrangel Island, far up in the Arctic near Siberia, until roughly 2000 BC. So for several centuries after Egypt built its most famous stone triangle, shaggy tusked elephants were still out there eating frozen grass like the Ice Age had missed the calendar update. To be fair, they were not roaming the world in giant herds anymore. It was one isolated island population. But still, in theory, an absurdly adventurous Egyptian traveler could have seen a living mammoth. The Pyramid Age and the Mammoth Age overlapped. Your mental timeline has officially been thrown into a ditch. 2. Frank and Martin Luther King Jr. were born in the same year, 1929. Frank arrived on June 12th in Frankfurt, Germany. King was born on January 15th in Atlanta, Georgia. Two people we usually place in totally separate historical folders, the Holocaust over here, the American Civil Rights Movement over there, were actually part of the same generation. Frank died in Bergen-Belsen in 1945 when she was only 15. King lived on to become the voice of a movement before being assassinated in 1968. Their lives unfolded on different continents, under different forms of hatred, but against the same ugly human problem: bigotry dressed up as law, culture, and power. Frank's diary and King's speeches came from people born within months of each other, right before the Great Depression shoved the world into chaos. 3. In November 1952, Israel offered Albert Einstein the presidency. Yes, that Albert Einstein. The hair, the relativity, the brain that made everyone else feel like they were still assembling a sandwich. After Israel's first president, Chaim Weizmann, died, Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion believed the role should be offered to the most famous Jewish figure alive. Einstein was 73, living in Princeton, and very much not looking for a late-career side quest in national leadership. He politely refused, explaining that he lacked both the experience and the natural talent for dealing with people. Honestly, relatable. The Israeli presidency was mostly ceremonial, so he would not have been micromanaging roads and taxes. But still, President Einstein was a real possibility. Instead of becoming a head of state, he stayed with physics and kept chasing his unfinished unified field theory. 4. George Washington died in 1799. The word dinosaur was not invented until 1842, which means the first president of the United States, the man on the $1 bill, lived and died without knowing dinosaurs were a thing. Not because he skipped school. The concept simply did not exist yet. People found enormous bones and blamed giants, dragons, biblical mysteries, or some extremely suspicious oversized animal. Then English paleontologist Richard Owen studied fossils from several extinct reptiles and created the term dinosauria, meaning terrible lizards. If you had shown Washington a Tyrannosaurus rex skeleton, his brain would have had no folder to put it in. The Founding Fathers could imagine revolutions, republics, constitutions, and powdered wigs as a fashion choice. But giant prehistoric reptiles ruling the planet? Absolutely not on the menu. 5. In 1932, Australia went to war against emus. Real emus. Tall, fast, angry-looking birds with the confidence of unpaid parking inspectors. After World War I, veterans were given farmland in Western Australia, and when roughly 20,000 emus migrated through the area and started wrecking crops, farmers demanded military help. So the government sent soldiers with Lewis machine guns. What followed was not so much a battle as a national embarrassment with feathers. The emus scattered into small groups, sprinted away, absorbed bullets better than anyone expected, and generally treated the army like confused tourists. After several days and thousands of rounds fired, only a few hundred birds were killed. The operation was called off, and politicians joked that the emus deserved medals. Australia had deployed machine guns against birds and somehow came away looking underprepared. 6. Ancient Romans used urine as mouthwash to whiten their teeth. Human urine, animal urine, take your pick. To them, this was not some humiliating punishment from a nightmare dentist. It was hygiene. The ammonia in urine actually has bleaching properties, so chemically speaking, they were disgusting but not completely wrong. The poet Catullus even mocked a man for having teeth so suspiciously white that he implied the guy must be gargling pee every morning like a champion. Urine was also valuable for tanning leather, cleaning clothes, and dyeing fabric, which is why Emperor Vespasian taxed it. When his son complained about the nasty source of revenue, Vespasian supposedly held up a coin and asked whether it smelled bad. That is where the idea money does not stink comes from. Roman economics, powered by empire, conquest, and public toilets. 7. Abraham Lincoln is in the National Wrestling Hall of Fame. The same Lincoln who delivered the Gettysburg Address and became America's top-hatted symbol of moral seriousness was also apparently terrifying in a wrestling match. He stood 6 feet 4 inches, enormous for his time, and built a reputation in Illinois as a man you did not casually challenge unless you enjoyed becoming scenery. His legendary record is often given as about 299 wins and just 1 loss over roughly 12 years. In one famous match against Jack Armstrong, a local tough guy from New Salem, Armstrong tried dirty tricks. Lincoln responded by lifting him and slamming him to the ground. Subtle. After that, Armstrong's rowdy friends actually became Lincoln supporters. Lincoln reportedly bragged that he was the big buck of this lick, which is basically frontier trash talk with better posture. 8. Chainsaws were invented for childbirth. Yes, the tool now associated with lumberjacks and horror movies began as medical equipment because history apparently enjoys jump scares. In the 1780s, Scottish doctors John Aitken and James Jeffrey developed a small hand-cranked chainsaw for a procedure called symphysiotomy. When a baby was stuck during delivery, doctors could cut through part of the mother's pelvic bone to widen the birth canal. There was no modern anesthesia, just a little chain with teeth, a hand crank, and a woman fully conscious while medicine tried its best in the most terrifying way imaginable. Caesarean sections existed, but they were often deadly at the time, so this somehow counted as an option. Only later did people look at the device and decide it might be useful on trees. Humanity really does invent the nightmare version first. 9. Oxford University was teaching students before the Aztec Empire existed. Teaching at Oxford goes back to around 1096, making it the oldest university in the English-speaking world. The Mexica founded Tenochtitlan in 1325, and the Aztec Empire truly rose later with the Triple Alliance in 1428. So by the time the Aztecs were building a powerful capital on Lake Texcoco, Oxford had already been educating people for centuries. That feels illegal to the brain, because we file the Aztecs under ancient civilization and Oxford under old fancy university with gowns. But when Spanish conquistadors reached Tenochtitlan and were stunned by its scale, canals, markets, and temples, Oxford was already old enough to have traditions, academic arguments, and probably students complaining about everything. European university life predates some civilizations we imagine as far older. History refuses to stand in a straight line. 10. Cleopatra lived closer to the iPhone than to the building of the Great Pyramid. This fact sounds like someone dropped the timeline on the floor, but it is true. The Great Pyramid of Giza was completed around 2560 BC. Cleopatra was born in 69 BC and died in 30 BC. That means the pyramids were already about 2,500 years old during her lifetime. To her, they were not fresh royal projects. They were ancient monuments from a deep, mysterious past. Now compare that to the first iPhone, released in 2007, about 2,037 years after Cleopatra's death. So Cleopatra is closer to touchscreen apps than to pyramid construction. She lived in a world of Roman politics, Greek culture, libraries, diplomacy, and palace intrigue. The pyramids were already ancient history. Time is not a neat line. It is a chaotic drawer full of broken clocks. 11. Nintendo was founded in 1889, not 1989. Not around the time your cousin got a Game Boy. 1889. When Nintendo opened in Kyoto, it made handmade Hanafuda playing cards. At that same moment, the Eiffel Tower was being completed. Jack the Ripper was still fresh in London's memory, and powered airplanes did not exist. Radio was not a normal household thing. Both world wars were still in the future. Fusajiro Yamauchi started a card company, not a kingdom of plumbers, princesses, mushrooms, swords, and emotional childhood nostalgia. For decades, Nintendo was connected to traditional card games, gambling circles, and ordinary physical products. Only much later did it move through toys and eventually into video games. So yes, Mario's corporate ancestor was basically a 19th century Japanese card shop. The jump from Hanafuda cards to fighting Bowser is corporate evolution on hard mode. 12. The American Civil War ended in 1865, yet as of reports from 2024, at least one confirmed child of a Civil War veteran was still alive. His name is William Poole, born in 1925 to a father born in 1844. That sentence feels like a glitch. A living person had a parent who fought in a war most people mentally store next to candlelight and daguerreotypes. But long lives and late fatherhood can stretch history in ridiculous ways. Civil War veterans lived into the age of cars, airplanes, radio, and even nuclear weapons. Albert Wilson, the last verified Union veteran, died in 1956. That means someone who belonged to Lincoln's wartime generation lived long enough to see the early Cold War. History is not sealed behind museum glass. It is connected by actual families, awkwardly long timelines, and generations that overlap far more than our textbooks make us feel. 13. In 1980, Detroit gave Saddam Hussein a key to the city. Yes, that's Saddam Hussein, the man who later became one of America's most infamous enemies. At the time, though, the geopolitical mood board looked very different. Iraq was seen as a useful counterweight against Iran, especially after the Iranian Revolution and the hostage crisis. Saddam had donated nearly $500,000 to a Chaldean church in Detroit, a city with a large Iraqi Christian community. Mayor Coleman Young approved the honor, and a delegation went to Baghdad to present the key. This was the strange era when American interests and Iraqi interests briefly stood in the same awkward photo together. The future Gulf War villain was, for a moment, treated like a helpful international friend. Geopolitics has the memory of a goldfish and the moral consistency of a vending machine. 14. The London Underground opened in 1863. While the American Civil War was still raging and cowboys were still very much part of the frontier, Londoners were already taking the subway. The Metropolitan Railway ran between Paddington and Farringdon using steam locomotives, which sounds impressive until you remember that steam in tunnels means smoke, soot, coughing, and probably the smell of an industrial chimney trapped under a city. Passengers sometimes fainted, because Victorian progress often came with a free health hazard. Still, it was an underground train a full decade before the telephone. While Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday were living in the world we imagine as dusty saloons and gunfights, London commuters were reading newspapers underground and complaining about transport. The future and the Wild West were happening at the same time, just in different outfits. 15. Harvard was founded in 1636. Isaac Newton did not publish his laws of motion and universal gravitation until 1687. So Harvard was teaching students for more than 50 years before the basic framework of modern physics hit the shelves. Early students were not sitting there learning Newton's laws, because Newton had not yet given the universe its instruction manual. They studied theology, classical languages, philosophy, logic, and the kind of early science that was still trying to separate itself from old assumptions. Calculus did not exist in its familiar form. Gravity was something everyone experienced, but nobody had explained it with the elegance that would later make Newton famous. Harvard graduates could read Latin and argue doctrine, but they did not know why planets moved the way they did. Education was already running, while discovery was still tying its shoes. 16. Before becoming Pope Francis, Jorge Mario Bergoglio worked as a nightclub bouncer in Buenos Aires. That is a real career arc. From standing at the door dealing with drunk troublemakers to standing on the Vatican balcony blessing massive crowds. As a young man, Bergoglio took various jobs while studying, including sweeping floors and working in a chemical laboratory. The bouncer job is the one that feels almost too cinematic. Imagine trying to start a fight in a club and the future pope tells you your evening is over. Bergoglio has often spoken about his ordinary working-class background, which helped shape his public image as a more grounded religious leader. And honestly, managing rowdy nightlife probably teaches useful skills for church politics: patience, crowd control, conflict resolution, and knowing when someone needs to be escorted away from the premises. 17. Swiss women could not vote in federal elections until 1971. That same year, Intel released the first commercial microprocessor, the Soviet Union launched the first space station, and humanity was casually doing things in orbit. Meanwhile, Switzerland, one of the wealthiest and most organized countries on Earth, was still debating whether women should be allowed to vote nationally. The decision came through a referendum in which only men were allowed to vote. About 65% of Swiss men finally agreed to let women participate in democracy, which is a very Swiss way to make equality wait politely in the hallway. And it still was not fully finished. The canton of Appenzell-Innerrhoden resisted women's local voting rights until 1990, when the federal Supreme Court forced the issue. 1990. The Berlin Wall had fallen, and one Swiss canton was still buffering. 18. Tyrannosaurus rex lived closer to humans than to Stegosaurus. The gap between Stegosaurus and Tyrannosaurus rex was roughly 80 to 85 million years. The gap between Tyrannosaurus rex and Eus is about 66 million years. So if a Tyrannosaurus rex had somehow studied fossils, Stegosaurus would have been ancient history to it. Museum murals and movies love throwing every dinosaur into one prehistoric monster party, but that is basically fake attendance. These animals were separated by oceans of time. Human civilization looks like a sneeze compared with the Mesozoic era, which lasted about 186 million years. Dinosaur species rose, dominated, vanished, and became fossil trivia long before other famous dinosaurs even showed up. Stegosaurus and Tyrannosaurus rex did not hang out. They missed each other by more time than separates us from the asteroid that ended the party. 19. In 1866, Liechtenstein sent 80 soldiers to guard the Brenner Pass during the Austro-Prussian War. When they came back, there were 81. They had gained a friend. This might be the most adorable military anecdote ever smuggled into history. Liechtenstein was allied with Austria, but its tiny force did not see combat. They guarded a mountain pass, apparently avoided disaster, and returned with an extra man, usually described as an Austrian liaison officer who liked them enough to tag along. No glorious charge, no tragic battlefield, no dramatic last stand. Just a small country sending out troops and coming home with a bonus soldier. That is a 1.25% army expansion through social skills. Soon after, Liechtenstein abolished its army entirely, which feels like retiring undefeated. If your final military campaign ends with more people than you started with, why risk the perfect record? 20. France's last execution by guillotine happened on September 10, 1977. 1 month later, Star Wars opened in French theaters. Sit with that for a moment. In the same cultural moment that audiences were meeting Luke Skywalker, lightsabers, and space battles, France had just used a decapitation machine associated with the French Revolution. The executed man was Hamida Djandoubi, and the guillotine remained France's official method of capital punishment until the death penalty was abolished in 1981. So the late 1970s had disco, science fiction blockbusters, modern television, and an 18th century blade still sitting inside the legal system like a cursed antique nobody had removed from storage. The past and the future did not take turns. They overlapped, shook hands awkwardly, and made the timeline feel deeply uncomfortable. 21. Queen Elizabeth II, and Marilyn Monroe were born in the same year, 1926. Elizabeth was born on April 21st in London, into royalty and duty. Marilyn was born Norma Jean Mortensen on June 1st in Los Angeles, into a life that would become glamour, fame, and tragedy. They even met in 1956 at a film premiere in London, both 30 years old, both among the most photographed women alive, but living in completely different universes. Marilyn died in 1962 at only 36. Elizabeth reigned until 2022 and died at 96. One became a symbol of Hollywood beauty, vulnerability, and the brutal machinery of fame. The other became a symbol of monarchy, stability, and public obligation. Same birth year, same century, same global spotlight, but two radically different rides through modern history. 22. Warner Brothers was founded on April 4, 1923. The Ottoman Empire officially ended on October 29, 1923, when Turkey became a republic. That means, for several months, a Hollywood studio and a centuries-old empire that began in the late 13th century existed at the same time. Harry, Albert, Sam, and Jack Warner were building a film company while the last pieces of an empire that had ruled across 3 continents were collapsing. A few years later, Warner Brothers would help change cinema forever with The Jazz Singer, one of the first major talking pictures. But in 1923, silent movies and imperial aftershocks shared the same newspapers. You could be reading about the birth of modern Hollywood on one page and the final end of an old sultanate on another. Empires fell. Entertainment took notes and bought better lighting. 23. Humans walked on the moon before someone successfully sold wheeled luggage as a modern travel product. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin stepped onto the lunar surface on July 20, 1969, after a giant technological effort involving rockets, computers, engineers, and national prestige. Then, in 1970, luggage executive Bernard Sadow noticed a worker moving heavy equipment on a wheeled platform and thought, essentially, "Why are we dragging suitcases like medieval peasants?" The idea seems painfully obvious now, which is exactly why it is hilarious. We escaped Earth's gravity, crossed space, landed on another world, and came home safely, but airports were still full of people carrying heavy bags by hand. Sadow even had trouble convincing stores that rolling suitcases were useful. Humanity can calculate lunar trajectories but needs extra time to put tiny wheels on a box. 24. In 1989, Pepsi briefly owned 17 submarines, a cruiser, a frigate, and a destroyer. For a short, ridiculous moment, a soft drink company had one of the largest military fleets in the world. This happened because the Soviet Union loved Pepsi but could not easily pay in rubles, which were not useful on international markets. Earlier deals involved trading vodka. Later, when the arrangement expanded, the Soviets offered old military vessels meant for scrap. Pepsi accepted the ships and quickly sold them to a Swedish company for recycling, because even in the wildest Cold War subplot, Pepsi was not actually planning naval operations. Pepsi's chief executive reportedly joked to American officials that the company was disarming the Soviet Union faster than they were. Imagine ordering a cola and accidentally participating in superpower diplomacy. The Cold War was sponsored by pure weirdness. 25. Sudan has more pyramids than Egypt. Egypt has around 118 to 138 pyramids, depending on the count. Sudan has over 200, and some estimates go up to about 255. These are Nubian pyramids, especially at Meroe and other Kushite sites, built by rulers of the Kingdom of Kush from roughly 700 BC to 300 AD. They tend to be smaller and steeper than the Egyptian ones, but there are simply more of them. The Kingdom of Kush was not some historical footnote either. It traded with Egypt, fought Egypt, and at times ruled Egypt. Yet most people could name Giza instantly and would stare blankly at Meroe. Some Sudanese pyramids were badly damaged by treasure hunters, including Giuseppe Ferlini, who smashed into many of them in the 1830s looking for gold. Ancient monuments meet 19th century greed with a shovel. 26. The Methuselah tree, a Great Basin bristlecone pine in California's White Mountains, is about 4,850 years old. That means it was already alive when Stonehenge was being built between roughly 3000 and 2000 BC. While ancient Britons were dragging giant stones around like the world's most exhausting group project, this tree was quietly growing. It was alive during the Pyramid Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the rise and fall of Rome, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution, and your last software update. It is still alive today, in a secret location protected by the United States Forest Service because people have a magical ability to destroy things by loving them too aggressively. One organism has been standing there photosynthesizing through almost 5,000 years of human drama. Empires came and went. The tree kept its schedule. 27. The lighter was invented before the match. In 1823, German chemist Johann Wolfgang Dobereiner created Dobereiner's lamp, a device that used hydrogen gas and a platinum catalyst to produce flame. It was clever, bulky, expensive, and packed with enough chemical drama to make it a terrible pocket accessory, but it worked. The friction match, the simple little stick version people actually recognize, came later in 1826 thanks to English chemist John Walker. So humanity developed a complicated chemical fire machine before settling on the obvious idea of putting reactive material on a stick and striking it. The rich loved Dobereiner's lamp because it looked like a scientific wonder, the kind of thing you showed guests at dinner to prove you were educated and slightly dangerous. Sometimes progress arrives wearing a lab coat, then later comes back as a cheap box of matches. 28. The fax machine was patented in 1843 by Scottish inventor Alexander Bain. That is before the American Civil War, before the common electric light bulb, and before many homes had anything close to modern plumbing. Even better, Japan's samurai order was still alive in that era, with its final dismantling coming during and after the Meiji Restoration. So yes, there was a weird overlap where a samurai could theoretically have sent a fax. Not a sleek office fax with jammed paper and passive-aggressive beeping, but an early electrical image transmission system using wires and scanning principles. Abraham Lincoln lived in the age of fax technology. The shogun could, in theory, have sent a primitive document over a wire. The next time a fax machine annoys you, remember, that cranky office relic is older than the end of samurai Japan. 29. Napoleon Bonaparte was once attacked by rabbits and retreated. The man who conquered much of Europe, terrified monarchs, and rewrote military history was defeated by fluffy livestock with bad boundaries. In 1807, after the treaties of Tilsit, Napoleon planned a grand rabbit hunt. His chief of staff, Alexandre Berthier, arranged thousands of rabbits for the event. Unfortunately, they were domesticated rabbits, not wild ones. When released, they did not flee, they charged. To them, humans meant food, not danger, so hundreds of rabbits swarmed Napoleon and his party like tiny, adorable imperial assassins. The emperor tried to stand his ground, but the rabbits kept coming. He eventually fled to his carriage, with some accounts saying rabbits even tried to follow him inside. Napoleon survived Europe's armies, but farm rabbits forced a tactical withdrawal. 30. The Anglo-Zanzibar War of 1896 lasted around 38 to 45 minutes, making it the shortest recorded war in history. The British Empire demanded that the Sultan of Zanzibar step down. He refused. The British responded with warships and shelled his palace until the whole argument was settled with terrifying efficiency. The palace was destroyed. Hundreds of the Sultan's defenders were killed or wounded, and the British suffered one injured sailor. The Sultan fled to the German consulate, and the conflict was over before a slow breakfast would have ended. Calling it a war almost feels generous. It was more like a very aggressive appointment with imperial artillery. But it had sovereign powers, demands, fighting, casualties, and a clear ending, so history files it as a war. You have probably spent longer choosing something to watch than this entire conflict lasted. 31. Pablo Picasso died on April 8, 1973. Pink Floyd released The Dark Side of the Moon on March 1, 1973. So Picasso was alive when one of the most famous rock albums ever made entered the world. We often imagine Picasso as if he belongs with dusty old masters from another century, but he lived deep into the modern age. He was alive during the moon landing, the Vietnam War, Watergate, color television, and the rise of progressive rock. The man who painted Guernica could theoretically have heard Money or Time on the radio during his final weeks. That is how strange the 20th century was. It stretched from horse-drawn habits and old empires to rockets, electric guitars, mass media, and modern celebrity culture. Some people who feel ancient in our imagination were actually close enough to touch the world we recognize. 32. Sharks are older than trees. Sharks have been in Earth's oceans for roughly 450 million years. Trees, meaning land plants with trunks and leaves in the familiar sense, appeared around 385 million years ago. That gives sharks about a 65 million year head start over forests. They were already swimming through ancient seas when land was mostly bare rock, having a very dull personality. Sharks predate dinosaurs by about 200 million years, survived 5 major mass extinctions, and kept going after the asteroid wiped out the non-avian dinosaurs. When the first forests finally appeared, sharks had already been doing shark business for an almost insulting amount of time. They watched life crawl from water onto land, in the broad evolutionary sense, and basically remained the ocean's permanent background threat. Trees are ancient. Sharks looked at trees and thought, "Cute, new arrival." So now, the timeline is officially ruined. But here's the real test. What fact did we miss? That sounds even more fake than sharks being older than trees, or France using the guillotine in the Star Wars era. Drop it in the comments, and if it is weak, people will absolutely judge you. Like the video if at least one fact broke your brain, and subscribe for more history that makes textbooks look suspiciously boring.